Richard Harper sat by the window, staring out at the vast stretch of autumn-colored trees. The golden leaves rustled in the wind, whispering secrets of seasons gone by. He held a cup of coffee in his wrinkled hands, its warmth a stark contrast to the cool morning air, 78 years old. It wasn't the number that unsettled him, but the weight of it. He had spent a lifetime chasing success, building a career, securing his wealth. Yet now, in the quiet of his home, an unsettling question lingered in his mind. What had it all been for? For decades, Richard had lived in the fast lane, always reaching for the next milestone. Promotions, investments, a bigger house, a better car. Each achievement had felt like a step toward something greater. But standing at the peak, looking back down at the path he had climbed, he wasn't sure if he had conquered life or if life had quietly slipped through his fingers. A loud chime broke his thoughts. His phone vibrated on the wooden table beside. Imam. A name flashed on the screen. Emily Harper, his daughter. Richard hesitated before picking up. It had been weeks since they last spoke, not because they were angry or estranged, but because life had simply drifted them apart. She was busy, with work, raising her own family, living her life, just as he once had. "Hey, Dad." Her voice was warm, yet distant. "Just checking in, how are you? How was he?" He almost laughed. Did she mean physically, mentally, or something deeper? He looked around his quiet home, at the empty chair across from him, the unused plates in the kitchen, the old photographs lining the shelves. "I'm fine," he said, the automatic response rolling off his tongue. A pause. "That's good," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. "Maybe I'll come visit next weekend if I can get some time off." Richard smiled. "That would be nice." They exchanged a few more words before she had to go. Work, meetings, deadlines, he understood. After all, he had lived that life. He had once been her. As he set the phone down, an old memory surfaced. Years ago, when Emily was just a little girl, she had asked him why he was always so busy. "I have to work hard now," he had told her, "so we can have a better future." But standing here now, in the so-called future, he wondered, was it really better? The world teaches us that success is measured in dollars, titles, and possessions. That if we just work a little harder, push a little further, we will finally reach a place where we can rest and enjoy life. But what if, in our pursuit of more, we forget to live at all? If you've ever found yourself looking back, wondering where the time went, you're not alone. If you've ever questioned whether the things you once chased were truly worth it, you're in good company. And if you, like Richard, have ever wondered if it's too late to change, let me tell you this: it's never too late. Join me on this journey as we explore what it truly means to live well, to let go of what no longer serves us, and to embrace the simple joys that make life meaningful. If this story resonates with you, consider supporting this channel. Your thoughts, comments, and experiences help keep these conversations alive. Now let's begin. A shift in perspective. Over time, Richard Harper had spent most of his life moving at full speed, fueled by ambition, deadlines, and the relentless pursuit of success. The world had taught him that a well-lived life was one filled with achievements, wealth, and recognition. And so, he had chased them all, believing, as most do, that these things would bring him happiness. Now, sitting in the stillness of his home, he realized how little he had ever paused to question it. He could still remember the first time he felt that intoxicating rush of success. He had just landed a major deal, one that would propel his career forward, and as he walked into his house that night, his heart was pounding with excitement. Emily, no older than 6, ran to greet him, wrapping her tiny arms around his legs. His wife, Margaret, smiled from across the room, holding a plate of warm food. But instead of soaking in that moment, he had been distracted, his mind already racing toward the next deal, the next goal. This is just the beginning, he had thought. I'll make time for them later, a word he had used too often. Later became weeks, weeks became years, and before he knew it, time had carried him forward like a river, swift and unforgiving. Emily grew up, Margaret grew older. And somewhere along the way, the things that once seemed urgent meetings, promotions, financial security, had quietly replaced the things that were truly important. But life has a way of forcing clarity upon us. For Richard, it came the day he stood in a silent hospital room, holding Margaret's fragile hand as she took her last breath. She had battled illness for years, yet somehow he had never thought he would lose her. Not really. "I wish we had more time," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. And just like that, the weight of all the moments he had missed came crashing down on him. The dinners he had rushed through, the vacations he had postponed, the nights he had stayed late at the office while she sat alone at home. Time, once abundant, had run out. It's a cruel irony, isn't it? When we are young, we believe time is infinite. We tell ourselves that sacrifices must be made for success, that we can always come back to the things we love later. But time is not something we can store away like money in a bank. It slips through our fingers, unnoticed, until one day we look up and realize how much of it we have spent on things that, in the end, mattered least. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a framed photograph on the shelf. It was an old picture, Margaret, Emily, and him at the beach, sun-kissed and laughing. He barely remembered the trip. He had been on a business call for most of it. What had it all been for? The house was big, but empty. The bank account was full, but his heart was hollow. He had earned the life he once dreamed of, yet now he wondered if he had truly lived it. Sighing, Richard stood up and walked outside. The air was crisp, the scent of autumn thick in the breeze. He watched as a young father across the street played catch with his son, their laughter carrying through the air. It was a simple moment, nothing grand, nothing extravagant. Yet it was everything. For so long, Richard had been chasing something just out of reach, believing happiness was always one more success away. But happiness had never been in the next promotion or the next raise. It had always been in the everyday moments, the ones he had been too busy to notice. Margaret had always known. She had tried to tell him in the quiet ways that only a wife does, through warm meals, through patient smiles, through the way she never once asked for more than his presence. And now Richard finally understood. He couldn't turn back time, but he could change what he did with the time he had left. He could call Emily more often. He could take long walks just to appreciate the world around him. He could learn to slow down, to be present, to embrace life as it came rather than as he planned it. Because in the end, a well-lived life isn't measured by what we achieve, but by what we cherish. And Richard wasn't ready to let the rest of his life slip away unnoticed. Health is the greatest wealth. Richard Harper had never been one to worry about his health. For most of his life, he had treated his body like an afterthought, something that would always be there, always function, no matter how hard he pushed. Long nights at the office, skipped meals, stress-fueled coffee binges, and the occasional celebratory drink had all seemed like necessary sacrifices for success. He had always assumed there would be time to take care of himself later. But later had arrived. One cold autumn morning, Richard rose from his chair too quickly and felt the room tilt beneath him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he had to steady himself against the edge of the table. His heart pounded erratically, his breath shallow. He had felt moments of dizziness before, but this time it lingered. It was nothing, he told himself, just age catching up, just a little fatigue. But deep down, he knew better. That afternoon, he visited the doctor for the first time in years. "You've got high blood pressure," the doctor said, flipping through Richard's medical chart. "Your cholesterol isn't great either. Stress, poor diet, and lack of exercise have taken their toll." Richard scoffed, shifting in his chair. "Well, I've been busy." The doctor set down his pen and looked at him. "Busy doing what?" The words struck Richard harder than he expected. He had spent a lifetime working, sacrificing his health for meetings, deadlines, and business deals. And now, here he was, spending his hard-earned money on medication to fix the body he had neglected. It was a cruel irony, one he had never fully considered before. As he drove home, his mind drifted to an old friend, David. Years ago, they had both been ambitious young men, climbing the corporate ladder, living on caffeine and adrenaline. But David had suffered a stroke at 62. Richard had visited him in the hospital, watching the once energetic man struggle to speak, to walk, to even remember certain words. "I should have slowed down," David had told him, voice strained. "I thought I had time." Richard hadn't understood then, but he did now. That night, as he sat alone in his kitchen, he glanced at the clock. It was 7 p.m. In the past, this would have been the time he returned home from work, exhausted, too tired to do anything but sit in front of the TV with takeout. Instead, he made a different choice. He laced up an old pair of sneakers, the ones he had bought years ago with the intention of getting in shape, but had never actually worn, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. He started walking. Slowly at first, then with more purpose. For the first time in years, he noticed the way the air filled his lungs, the steady rhythm of his footsteps against the pavement. His body protested at the unfamiliar movement, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. With each step, he felt a little more awake, a little more alive. The next morning, he made another choice. Instead of reaching for coffee and a processed breakfast, he scrambled some eggs and sliced fresh fruit. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Small choices. That's how it begins. Richard. He knew he couldn't undo decades of neglect overnight, but he could choose differently today. He started taking morning walks, appreciating the way the sunlight hit the trees, the quiet hum of the world waking up. He cut back on the heavy meals, opting for something lighter, something that made him feel energized instead of sluggish. He prioritized sleep, something he had once treated as a luxury instead of a necessity. And slowly, something incredible happened. He began to feel better, not just physically, but mentally. The fog that had settled in his mind over the years, the stress, the exhaustion, the endless chase, started to lift. He felt present in his own life in a way he hadn't for years. One afternoon, as he walked through the park, he saw a father playing catch with his son. The boy laughed, his small hands reaching up to catch the ball, his father cheering him on. Richard smiled. Years ago, he had been too busy to do things like that with Emily, but perhaps it wasn't too late to start now. The doctor had said his health was in his hands. And for the first time, Richard believed it, because wealth meant nothing without the strength to enjoy it. Happiness does not come from material things. Richard Harper once believed that happiness could be measured in square footage, brand names, and the balance of a bank account. For years, he had worked tirelessly to accumulate more success, more wealth, more possessions, convinced that each milestone would bring him closer to a lasting sense of fulfillment. Yet, here he was, sitting alone in his grand, sunlit living room, surrounded by everything he had once dreamed of owning, and feeling nothing. The silence of his home was deafening. The luxurious leather couch, the expensive paintings on the wall, the gleaming marble countertops, these were things he had spent a lifetime working for. But now they felt cold, lifeless. They did not laugh with him. They did not listen. They did not love him back. Richard exhaled, running his fingers along the edge of the mahogany coffee table. It had cost him a fortune, imported from Italy, crafted by hand. But when had he last sat here and truly enjoyed it? A memory surfaced, one from decades ago, long before he could afford such things. He and Margaret had just moved into their first apartment. It was small, cramped, and furnished with second-hand furniture. They couldn't afford a proper dining table, so they ate dinner on the floor, using a stack of books as a makeshift surface. Margaret had made spaghetti that night, and as they twirled noodles around their forks, she had laughed, really laughed, at one of his terrible jokes. They had been happy. Truly, deeply happy. Not because of what they had, but because of who they were with. Richard closed his eyes. That night, with its peeling wallpaper and mismatched plates, had brought him more joy than any expensive meal in any five-star restaurant. So when, he wondered, had he started believing that happiness could be bought? Perhaps it was the way the world worked. Everywhere he looked, billboards, magazines, television, He had been told that more was better. A bigger house meant a better life. A luxury car meant status. A high-paying job meant success. He had chased these things relentlessly, convinced they were the keys to a meaningful existence. But the truth, as he was now realizing, was that material things were merely distractions. They provided comfort, yes, convenience, certainly. But happiness? That was something else entirely. One evening, as Richard was taking his usual walk through the park, he noticed a couple sitting on a bench. They looked to be in their late 60s, their hands intertwined. They weren't dressed in designer clothes, nor did they seem to be in a rush to be anywhere important. They simply sat there, watching the sunset, content in each other's company. Richard hesitated for a moment before approaching them. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" he said. The man nodded. "It always is if you take the time to notice." They struck up a conversation, and Richard learned that the couple had been married for over 40 years. They had never been wealthy, had never owned a large house or traveled the world. And yet, they spoke about their life together with a warmth and joy that Richard hadn't felt in years. "People spend so much time chasing things," the woman said. "But in the end, it's the simple moments that mean the most." Richard nodded, feeling an unexpected lump in his throat. That night, he returned home and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He pulled out an old photo album. There they were, Margaret, Emily, and him, captured in moments he had long forgotten. Emily in her Halloween costume, beaming with pride. Margaret standing in the kitchen, flour on her nose, laughing as she baked cookies. A younger version of himself, holding their daughter in his arms, completely unaware of how fast time would pass. Not one of those memories had anything to do with money. Richard let out a slow breath. Happiness had never been in the things he bought. It had always been in the moments he had lived, and perhaps, if he was lucky, there was still time to create more. Simplicity brings freedom. Richard Harper stood in the middle of his walk-in closet, surrounded by a lifetime of possessions. Suits, ties, expensive shoes, all carefully arranged, all symbols of a man who had spent decades chasing success. He reached out and ran his fingers over the fabric of a navy blue suit, the one he had worn to a corporate gala years ago. He tried to recall something significant from that evening, but all that remained was a vague memory of handshakes, forced smiles, and a sense that he should have been somewhere else. Perhaps at home, with Margaret. Perhaps reading Emily a bedtime story, but he had told himself, as he always did, that there would be time for those things later. Now, standing in this quiet house, time stretched before him in a different way. There were no more urgent meetings, no more late-night emails, no more business deals that couldn't wait. And yet, instead of feeling victorious for having made it, he felt burdened by the weight of things he no longer needed, by the silence that filled the spaces he had worked so hard to create. Richard sighed, pulled the suit from the hanger, folded it neatly, and placed it into a donation box. Then another, and another. The more he let go, the lighter he felt. For so long, he had believed that success was measured by accumulation. A bigger house, a luxury car, the latest technology. Each acquisition had been a marker of his achievements, proof that he had worked hard and won the game of life. But what had he really won? His mansion felt cavernous, his dining table sat unused, his wealth accumulated, but never truly enjoyed. The very things that were meant to bring security and happiness had only created a life of obligation, more to clean, more to manage, more to protect. He thought back to his childhood. His family had lived in a small house, nothing grand. His parents had never owned expensive things, but their home had been filled with warmth. He remembered sitting by the fireplace in the winter, listening to his father tell stories, the sound of his mother humming as she cooked dinner. They had never had much, but they had always had enough. He had been happy then, before he had been taught that happiness required more. It wasn't just his own memories that haunted him. He thought of his old friend Thomas, who had once been just like him, driven, ambitious, always reaching for the next milestone. But Thomas had walked away from it all. He had retired early, moved to a modest cottage in the countryside, and embraced a life of simplicity. Richard had visited him once, curious about the choice he had made. Thomas had greeted him with a warm smile, leading him into a home that was nothing like the grand estates they had once aspired to. The furniture was old but comfortable. A small, wooden table sat by the window, where Thomas had placed a cup of tea and a book. Outside, a garden bloomed with wildflowers, untouched by the rush of the world beyond. "Don't you miss it?" Richard had asked, gesturing vaguely to the modest surroundings. Thomas had laughed, shaking his head. "I have everything I need." At the time, Richard hadn't understood. But standing here now, watching his possessions pile up in the donation boxes, he felt something shift inside him. Over the next few weeks, he continued to let go. The garage filled with tools he had never used, the books he had bought but never read, the gadgets that had once seemed necessary but had only gathered dust. Each time he placed something into the donation pile, he felt a little freer. And with that freedom came clarity. He no longer needed to maintain a life that no longer fit him. He downsized his home, moving to a smaller, cozier space where every room had purpose. He stopped buying things out of habit. Instead of browsing catalogs for what to purchase next, he spent his time walking in the park, calling Emily just to hear her voice, sitting by the lake with nothing but his thoughts and the rustling of the trees for company. One evening, as he sat outside watching the sunset, he realized he felt something he hadn't felt in years: light. The weight of wanting more, needing more, proving more had lifted. For the first time, he was content. He had spent his whole life believing happiness came from adding things to his life. But now he understood the truth. Happiness often comes from taking things away. Because when you let go of what doesn't matter, you finally make space for what does. Saving and minimalism help us live lightly. Richard Harper had never been frugal. He had spent most of his life believing that money existed to be used, that success meant upgrading, bigger houses, finer suits, first-class flights. He had indulged in the best restaurants, collected luxury watches, and never thought twice about paying extra for convenience. It wasn't that he was reckless. He had always been financially responsible. But he had also believed that a life of abundance meant never having to worry about cutting back. Now at 78, he was beginning to understand that abundance had nothing to do with how much he owned, but how little he needed. One afternoon, as he sat at the kitchen table, he looked over his monthly expenses. The housekeeper, the premium cable package he rarely watched, the high-end gym membership he hadn't used in years. He had accumulated these expenses the way he had accumulated everything else, without much thought, without asking if they truly added value to his life. He set the papers down and looked around his home. It was large, elegant, and filled with carefully curated furnishings. Yet he had never felt lonelier. The dining room table, meant for 10, was always set but never used. The guest bedrooms remained untouched. The grand kitchen, with its marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances, was rarely more than a place to reheat takeout. A memory surfaced. Years ago, when he and Margaret were first married, they had lived in a tiny apartment with second-hand furniture. Money had been tight, and they had learned to stretch every dollar. Margaret had clipped coupons, and Richard had repaired things instead of replacing them. They had saved diligently, cooked at home, and taken simple pleasures in the small joys of life. And yet, those had been some of their happiest years. Back then, saving money had been a necessity. Now, it was a choice. Richard decided to simplify. He cancelled the services he didn't use, sold the luxury car that mostly sat in the garage, and moved into a smaller, more manageable home. He no longer saw the point in paying for space he didn't need, for things that didn't bring him joy. Instead of buying, he started appreciating. Instead of upgrading, he embraced what he already had. At first, the change felt strange. He had spent decades living in excess, and part of him wondered if cutting back would feel like a step backward. But the opposite happened. As his expenses shrank, so did his worries. There was a surprising lightness in knowing he no longer had to maintain an extravagant lifestyle. One day, while walking through town, he stopped at a local diner for coffee. He sat near the window, watching life pass by, the young couple sharing a milkshake, the elderly woman counting coins to pay for her meal. He thought about how much time he had spent chasing wealth, only to realize that happiness had never required it. The next morning he took a walk through a small farmer's market. He watched as people picked fresh produce, exchanged stories, and greeted each other by name. He had once thought that true luxury was dining in five-star restaurants, but now the idea of making a simple meal with fresh ingredients felt far more fulfilling. He bought a loaf of homemade bread, a handful of ripe tomatoes, and some fresh basil. That evening, he made himself a simple sandwich, slicing the tomatoes carefully, drizzling them with olive oil, layering them onto the bread. He sat by the window, looking out at the trees, and took a bite. It was nothing extravagant, nothing elaborate, but it was enough. For so long, he had believed that living well meant accumulating more. But now, he saw that living well meant needing less. It meant making intentional choices, finding satisfaction in simplicity, and realizing that freedom wasn't found in having endless resources, but in not being enslaved by them. Richard had once thought of frugality as restriction, as a sacrifice. But now he saw it as liberation. When he needed less, he worried less. When he spent less, he stressed less. And when he let go of the constant pursuit of more, he made space for something far greater, peace. He no longer felt the urge to chase wealth. Instead, he chased experiences. He found joy in a good book, in a conversation with a stranger, in the quiet pleasure of an afternoon spent doing nothing at all. He gave more to charity, helped his neighbors when he could, and felt richer than he ever had in his years of extravagance. As he sipped his coffee one morning, he realized something profound. The best things in life had always been free. The laughter of a loved one, the beauty of a sunrise, the warmth of a shared meal. These were the true treasures. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly wealthy. The most important legacy is the memories and positive influence we leave behind. Richard Harper sat on his porch, a cup of warm tea in his hands, watching the autumn leaves drift lazily to the ground. The world around him was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of the wind and the distant laughter of children playing in the park down the street. He had always loved the fall, the way the trees let go of their leaves without resistance, trusting that new life would come again, in the spring. It made him wonder about his own life and the things he would leave behind. For decades, Richard had believed that his legacy would be measured by the wealth he accumulated, the businesses he built, and the properties he owned. He had worked tirelessly, ensuring that his name carried weight in the corporate world, that his achievements were recognized. But now, as he neared 80, he found himself asking a different question. What truly remains when we are gone? The answer didn't lie in bank, statements, or property deeds. Those things could be spent, sold, or forgotten. The real legacy, he realized, was in the memories he had created and the impact he had left on others. One afternoon, Richard went up to the attic and pulled down an old wooden box. Inside were photographs, letters, small mementos from a life that had passed far too quickly. There was a faded picture of him and Margaret on their wedding day, her eyes shining with the kind of joy that needed no words. There were birthday cards from Emily, with her clumsy childhood handwriting declaring, "I love you, Daddy." There was a ticket stub from a baseball game they had attended when she was 10, a day he had almost cancelled because of work. He had forgotten about so many of these moments. Yet here they were, waiting for him, holding more value than anything he had ever bought. That evening, Emily called. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice soft. "I was just thinking about you." Richard smiled. "Funny, I was just thinking about you too." They talked for over an hour, reminiscing about old family vacations, inside jokes, moments that had once seemed small but now felt monumental. At the end of the conversation, Emily hesitated before saying, "You know, Dad, the best memories I have of you aren't the big things, not the house, not the gifts. It's the little things, the bedtime stories, the way you'd carry me on, your shoulders when I was tired, the time we built that terrible-looking treehouse in the backyard." Richard laughed. That treehouse was structurally unsound. Yes, Emily said, laughing too, but it was ours. After they hung up, Richard sat in the quiet for a long time. He thought about how much time he had spent worrying about the future, about providing, about achieving. He had assumed that success meant ensuring Emily had the best of everything. But what she cherished most weren't the things he had bought her. It was the time he had spent with her. Richard decided that night that he wanted to leave behind more than just financial security. He wanted to leave behind love, wisdom, and memories that would last longer than any inheritance. The next morning, he took out a notebook and began to write letters, to Emily, to his grandchildren, even to his younger self. He wrote about the lessons he had learned, the mistakes he had made, the things he wished someone had told him earlier. He filled pages with advice about love, kindness, and the importance of living in the present. He wrote about Margaret, about the things she had taught him without ever needing to say them out loud. He also started sharing more of his time. He volunteered at a local community center, teaching young adults financial literacy, passing down the knowledge he had spent a lifetime acquiring. He mentored a teenage boy who reminded him of himself at that age, restless, ambitious, uncertain of what truly mattered. He listened more, laughed more, and made sure that when he was gone, the people in his life would not just remember that he had existed, but that he had mattered. One crisp evening, Richard sat by the lake near his home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. He felt no regret about the things he had let go of, only gratitude for the moments he still had. Legacy, he realized, wasn't about being remembered by the world. It was about being remembered by the people who truly mattered. It was about the love you gave, the kindness you showed, the memories you left behind in the hearts of those who knew you. And in that moment, as the cool autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the air, Richard Harper knew that his life had been full. Not because of what he had gained, but because of what he had given. A fulfilling life. Richard Harper sat on the wooden bench by the lake, watching the water ripple under the golden light of the setting sun. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. No more deadlines, no more worries about status or wealth, no more chasing after things that never really mattered. Just the quiet hum of the world around him, the steady rhythm of his own breath, and the deep contentment that came from knowing he had finally learned how to live. Looking back, he saw his life in chapters. There was the chapter of ambition, where he had devoted himself to building a career, believing that success would bring happiness. Then came the chapter of realization, when he saw that the things he had sacrificed, time with his family, his health, his simple joys, were far more valuable than any paycheck. And now he was in the chapter of wisdom, where he understood that life was never about how much he owned, but how fully he embraced each moment. He had once feared aging, worried that growing old meant becoming irrelevant. But he had learned that with age came clarity, and with clarity came freedom. He no longer needed to prove himself. He no longer needed to keep up with the ever-moving finish line of success. Instead, he had discovered something far greater: peace in simplicity, joy in presence, and love in the connections that truly mattered. Richard thought of Emily, of the long phone calls they had shared recently, of the way her voice softened when she spoke to him, no longer distant but full of warmth. He thought of his grandchildren, how they clung to his hand when they visited, eager to hear his stories. He thought of the young man he had been mentoring, the way his eyes lit up when he finally understood that life was about living, not just surviving. Legacy, he realized, wasn't about the wealth he left behind. It was about the love, the wisdom, the kindness he had shared. It was about the laughter echoing in the hearts of those who remembered him, the lessons that would be passed down long after he was gone. As the sun dipped lower, Richard closed his eyes and breathed in the cool evening air. He had spent so many years rushing, always looking ahead to the next goal, the next milestone. But now, he was right where he needed to be, fully present, fully alive, and that was enough. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt the weight of chasing things that don't truly fulfill you, Know that it's never too late to change. A full life isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by how deeply we live. Let's embrace simplicity, find joy in the little things, and focus on what truly matters. If you believe in this message, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell, what is the greatest lesson life has taught you? And if you'd like to continue these meaningful conversations, consider supporting this channel. Your presence here is what makes these stories worth telling.